I often like to start out just telling a little bit about my background, how I got into politics, constitutionalism, and so on. And about a dozen years ago, a friend and neighbor of mine invited me to a class on the Constitution. That's really where it all began. And uniquely in this situation, he had invited me to a class on the Constitution, which he informed me was going to be held in my living room. And so I attended. And he had made arrangements with my wife in advance on that one. But from that class on the Constitution, I learned really two main things that I feel were really life-changing to me. Number one, I really got an understanding that we are not following the Constitution today. Now, it's a good thing you're all sitting down because I know that's a huge shock to everyone in the room. But number two, if we were to follow the Constitution today, it would solve the majority of the problems our nation is facing, including one of many, for example, is our national debt and our continually unbalanced budget and so on. One of many examples we could spend quite a bit of time going into, which we won't for tonight. But that awakened in me a desire to help in any way I could to get our nation back on track, to get us back to following the Constitution as written, as intended, would solve the majority of our nation's problems. And what I identified as the real problem, the real root of the problem behind all this, I'll be discussing tonight, and what I feel we need to do to help get our nation back on track. So, in tonight's discussion, Rein in Big Government with Article 6 is the key that I'll be pointing to, not Article 5. Here's a brief outline. We'll be covering three sections. First, is the system broken? Number two, what is the root of the problem we're facing? And then number three, what are the tools the Founding Fathers gave us and pointed to for reining in constitutional violations? And they spoke on that quite a bit. And I think you'll find their tools very interesting and useful. So first, is the system broken? On social media, every now and then I see this type of a meme shared, something like this. Congress has a 20% approval rating, but has a 97% re-election rate. What does this give you the idea of? Well, really, it gives me the feeling that the system's broken. We, the people, have no control over what's going on. Obviously, Congress is not very popular. So how is it, despite this really low popularity rating, they keep getting reelected by a 97% rate? The problem with this is actually very misinforming, misdirecting, misleading. Because do members of Congress run for re-election en masse as an entire group? Yes, I want to re-elect all of Congress or not? No, that's not how it works, is it? Each member of Congress runs for re-election individually in their home district. And what is their approval rating in that home district is a more important question to be asking. Another thing that shows the system and how our Congress is doing is the Freedom Index. This is a report published by the John Birch Society magazine, The New American, twice per year. It's essentially the voting records of Congress compared to the Constitution. And on average, as a whole, Congress is somewhere around a 34% in the last score, for example, in following the Constitution. Now, back in high school, I recall if I were to get a 34% on a test, how did I do on that test? I just failed, right? Congress is failing when it comes to upholding the Constitution as a whole. That is not a very good reflection of upholding your oath of office. Again, that makes you feel like maybe the system's broken, but let's go back to this approval rating concept. I'm going to pick on two members of Congress. Mitch McConnell, first of all. His Freedom Index rating, his cumulative lifetime of being in Congress, he has about a 60% average in following the Constitution. That's above average. I'll give him that. But again, letter grade on that? Yeah, that's pretty pathetic, isn't it? And I often compare the oath of office to the marital oath of fidelity. You're swearing an oath of fidelity to the Constitution and protecting the liberties of the people. And if you kept a marriage oath, about 60% of the time, how are you doing? That's pretty bad. You might get voted out of office, right? It probably should be. Now, as poor as he is doing of a job of following the Constitution, what are his poll ratings? Nationally, who cares? That's not what reelects him, is it? It's his own congressional district that is the issue here, or in his case, Senate. The average voter rating for Mitch McConnell is his reelection rate. Typically about 55% or so of his voters, his constituents in his home state. So by their view, is he doing a reasonable job enough to get reelected? Apparently so. He represents the views of his home state well enough to get reelected again and again. Sounds like the system is working. The next one I want to pick on, Nancy Pelosi. Fairly well known. And her cumulative index score here of an 18%. Yes, she has scored on a few times a 0 in following the Constitution. Not uncommon, for her anyway. What is her approval rating in her home district? Somewhere around 80% on average. She typically gets reelected by around an 80% of the vote. Wow. I would say, based on that she is really a very good representative of the views of her constituents. As upholding her oath of office, not so much. But again, this shows us that Congress really does, for the most part, represent the majority of their constituents, or they don't get reelected. Because in the end, it is we the people that pull the lever for or against reelecting them. This brings me to my favorite quote from President James Garfield. I think he said it best, where he says, "Now more than ever before, the people are responsible for the character of their Congress. If that body be ignorant, reckless, and corrupt." Try to imagine that. Congress, ignorance, reckless, corrupt. Okay, good. You got that? If Congress be ignorant, reckless, and corrupt, why? It is because the people tolerate ignorance, recklessness, and corruption and keep re-electing it, right? If, on the other hand, if it be intelligent, brave, and pure, it's because the people demand these high qualities to represent them in the national legislature. Who does that point the finger to of blame for the character of our Congress? We the people. We the people. In other words, the system is working. It is not broken. It is representing the will of the people generally across the country. Which brings me to ruby slippers. And this, hopefully, brings to your mind the story of the Wizard of Oz, where Dorothy Gale is told from the beginning, when she finds herself in Oz trying to find her way back, she's told to go find the wizard. And the wizard will be the solution to her problems. In the end, she finds him, and he turns out to be a fraud. And the real solution that she'd been seeking all along, she always had. She already had the power to solve her problem. She just didn't know it or how to use it. Click her heels 3 times. There's no place like home. Anyway, in the same way, as we the people feel like we are powerless to get Congress back on track, to get the federal government following the Constitution, we actually have had the power all along. I'll demonstrate that a little bit more as we analyze what is the root of the problem. And to illustrate this, forgive me, my father is a college professor. And so a little bit of that comes out of me. We have a pop quiz for you tonight. A quiz on the U.S. Constitution. And for me, the type of things that we need to quiz on aren't the trivia, like What's the minimum age requirement to run for U.S. House of Representatives? Well, it's 25, but is that the problem our nation's facing? The 24-year-olds are sneaking in under that rule, violating it? Or are our problems more deep than that? I have 10 questions for you from the Constitution, and these are ones I feel are crucial for people to know and understand, and if we understood these things generally across the country, it would totally change the political makeup of our nation. Now, granted, with this group, most of you are fairly politically active and informed. I expect you're going to score far better than if we were to do this same quiz just out on the streets of town here. But I want each of you to just mentally keep a tally of how many of these you feel like you already knew before I tell them to you. So question number 1, what does the Constitution say is necessary to the security of a free state? Don't blurt it out. Don't give the answer away. And just quick raise of hands. How many feel like you know this answer right off? Good portion of the room. I have to say that's actually higher than the last time I gave this quiz. Good. What is necessary to the security of a free state? A well-regulated militia, the Second Amendment tells us, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Interesting. That could be a class of its own. In fact, that is one of the lectures in my 6-lecture series, if you want to go deeper into that topic. Question number 2. What does the Constitution say about the duration of office for Supreme Court justices? Well, generally, the number 1 answer I get to this is wrong, which is life appointment. Where the Constitution actually says they shall hold their offices during good behavior. A good example of not good behavior, I'll turn to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who publicly admitted that she looks more to international law than she does to the Constitution in her rulings. And subsequently, she admits, I probably had violated my oath of office in so doing. But what does that matter? She has a life appointment, right? Well, no. Technically, no, she doesn't. She's only supposed to hold her office during good behavior. That is not good behavior, and she should be, what? Impeached. That's right. She should be impeached for that, and that is up to Congress. Congress should be doing that a lot more than they do, frankly. Okay, the next question. The decision of taking our country into war is in whose hands? Now, I find this one, most people that are fairly conservative and active and so on have an idea on this one, although most people generally don't. The Congress shall have the power to declare war. Again, that's worthy of its own lecture. The importance of placing that in the hands of Congress was something the founders felt very strongly about, that not one person, but a whole body of people would deliberate on whether or not we go to war. Number 4. How's everyone doing so far? Pretty good? Okay. What does the Constitution say about bills of credit? Generally, I have people ask, well, what is a bill of credit when I bring this one up? First, here's what it says about it, then we'll talk about what it is. No state shall emit bills of credit. That's the only mention. However, it was proposed. In the Constitutional Convention of 1787, they proposed the language of having Congress emit bills of credit, and they shot that one down. It was actually a carryover from the Articles of Confederation. They looked at that language and said, no, that's a dangerous power. We don't want to give that power to Congress. So what does the Constitution say about powers that are prohibited to the states, which this is, and not enumerated to Congress? That would be in the hands of the people only, according to the 10th Amendment. And what is a bill of credit? Well, technically, a bill of credit is really just a certificate of ownership, kind of like you get an IOU. I owe you 10 eggs or whatever. Originally, this came from you go deposit your gold at a bank, and they give you an IOU, certificate of ownership of that gold. This is what turns into eventually paper money. So the power to create or emit paper money was forbidden to the states and was never granted to Congress, which is why we don't use paper money today, right? or at least we shouldn't be, on the governmental level. We, the people, could trade in whatever we want. Okay, question 5. Are Supreme Court rulings included in the Supremacy Clause as part of the supreme law of the land? Interestingly, no. Only the Constitution, laws made in following the Constitution, and treaties made under its authority are supreme law of the land. Supreme Court rulings aren't supposed to be law at all. Number 6, the enumerated powers of Congress are found in Article what and Section what? Another raise of hands on this one. How many know this one offhand? Good portion, good. When someone wants to learn the Constitution, this is where I send them first. Get to know the enumerated powers of Congress found in Article 1, Section 8. This is the list of their general lawmaking powers. Congress does have power to make laws in other parts of the Constitution on rare exceptions, such as in Article 4, the admittance of new states. They can make the laws regarding that as well. But their regular lawmaking powers is Article 1, Section 8. Good place to begin to get to know what Congress and what the federal government is authorized to have in their jurisdiction. And kind of a follow-up question on this one, number 7, what are the 3 things that Congress is authorized to spend money on? I remember the first time that was asked of me, I thought, really? They're only authorized 3 things? Yes, it's 3 categories. And those categories are, the Congress shall have power to raise money, lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, excises, to pay the debts, provide for the common defense, and general welfare. Those are the 3 categories they're allowed to raise and spend money on. And then thereafter, in Article 1, Section 8, we have 2 categories of expenses listed. You have the general welfare powers, clauses 2 through 9 and 17. And then you have the common defense powers, clauses 10 through 16. So these enumerated powers of Congress are in the categories of either general welfare powers or common defense powers for which Congress can expend money. And then you have the conclusion, Clause 18, the necessary and proper clause, saying Congress can make any laws necessary to implement powers they are actually given. Article 1, Section 8. Great place to start getting to know the Constitution. Now, question 8. We're almost there. What are the 5 purposes for which the federal government can own and control land within the state? When I gave my son this quiz, he was able to come up with 4 of the 5. This is the only one he missed on my test, so all right, he did okay. This is Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, where Congress is authorized to control land within a state that is purchased by the consent of the legislatures for these purposes. Forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings. And I think they must have forgotten federal wilderness areas or something. I'm not sure. It wasn't listed, was it? Interesting list. Forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, other needful buildings. Do you see how this knowledge would start to rein in what is going on in our federal government if these questions were well known and understood nationally? 2 more questions. How much of the lawmaking power was granted by the Constitution was given to Congress? And how much the President and how much the Supreme Court? I think most of you know this answer, right? Raise your hands again one more time. How many? No. Okay, get most of you. Good. Article 1, Section 1, right after the preamble of the Constitution, tells us all legislative powers, lawmaking powers, that are granted by the Constitution shall be vested in a Congress. Do you know what the word all means? The word all, let's try it. Let's see. If all lawmaking powers in Congress, how much does that leave to the President? None, right? If all lawmaking power is in Congress, how much does that leave to the Supreme Court? How much does that leave to the regulatory agencies? None. That's pretty restricting, isn't it? Only Congress has the power to make laws. And I list those other ones because all of them have at times made effectively laws. The President, Supreme Court, regulatory agencies are all lawmaking these days, even though it couldn't be more clear. All lawmaking power is in Congress. Final question. In a checks and balances showdown, which of the three branches holds the highest power, or are they all equal? Let's play this one out. If Congress creates a bill, they pass it, it's going to be a law, it then goes to the President, can he stop it? How does he stop it? Veto, right. Can Congress do anything about that? Of course, they can override the veto, right? Now, can the President do anything? Technically, yes. By virtue of the fact that the implementation of law intentionally was put in separate hands from those who create the law. This is what the founders intended, was that that would be a check, that if there was a law so bad, even though they overrode his veto, he is the one that has to implement the law. Has a president ever refused to implement a law? Yes, quite a few times actually. And that is the power he has in his position as a separate body in the federal government. That was intentional. Now, he's supposed to be swearing an oath to uphold the law, to faithfully execute the law, and so on. But if there's a law that is unconstitutional, if I were president, absolutely, I would be refusing to implement it. That's his job by swearing his oath of office. In the same way with Congress versus the courts, what happens there? Ultimately, they again have the power to shoot down laws made by Congress, right? Not enforce them. But what can Congress do in both cases? If the president refuses to implement a law, if the courts refuse to enforce a law, does Congress have any recourse? In both cases, Congress ultimately has the power of impeachment. That's really the highest power, because at that point, can they do anything in response? Gripe and complain on the evening news, but that's about it, right? Once they've been impeached, they no longer have any power. The highest power, the ultimate power in these checks and balances is the power of impeachment, the power to remove them from office. Congress wins. In a checks and balances showdown with the other two branches of government, Congress wins every time if they choose to, making them the most powerful branch of the government. That's an important thing to know, because Congress can fix the other branches of the federal government. So now, to conclude the root of the problem here, great quote from Alexis de Tocqueville. He explains to us from a different perspective when we didn't have this problem. He tells us, this is back in the early 1800s, that one of the greatest strengths of America, he says, in America, every citizen is taught the history of his country and the leading features of its Constitution. He goes on, it is extremely rare to find a man imperfectly acquainted with all these things. And a person wholly ignorant of them is sort of a phenomenon. Does that sound like today to you? How did everyone do on the quiz, by the way? Okay, fair, somewhat. More importantly, and again, like I said from the beginning, I expect this group did better by quite a bit than if we were to take the same Constitution quiz out on the street, right? What would you guess would be the average score in your hometown if we just publicly ask everybody the Constitution quiz we just went through? Do you think most people would get half of them right? No, definitely not. Do you think that most people would get at least one right? No. In my experience traveling around the country interacting with even political activists, I find that most people would fail the test, and very few on the public in general would get even one of them right. How does that compare to Alexis de Tocqueville's day? Just the opposite. I would conclude his statement here to say, instead, it is extremely rare to find a man who is vaguely familiar with all these things. And a person wholly educated on them is sort of a phenomenon. If we totally reverse his statement, it then applies to today. That is the root of the problem. In Federalist 16, Hamilton tells us the people are the natural guardians of the Constitution. I would compare this to you're playing a sporting game where the referees have never read the rules and have no idea how the game's supposed to be played. And the players have begun to figure this out, and they don't bother reading the rules either, because why? They don't need to. We, the people, don't know the rules. So why should they have to follow them? It really is that simple, isn't it? Washington, D.C. doesn't play by the rules because we, the people, don't know the rules. That is the root of the problem. How could it be any different? How could it be any different if the people don't know the rules and don't insist on them being enforced? What else would we expect? Which then really points to what the real solution is. Now, tonight, as we're talking about using Article 6, not Article 5, think about that for just a moment. Article 5 is the way of making amendments to the Constitution. Can you think of an amendment that would solve this problem? It's now constitutionally mandatory that everybody know the Constitution. They'd probably just ignore that provision as much as any other. We cannot solve the problem unless we solve the root of the problem. And so either we have to change the Constitution to be less reflective of the will of the people, or we have to change the people to enforce the Constitution. So, as we jump into tools to rein in constitutional violations, let's look at what the founders actually said to do. The first one, we will look at what they said Article 5 was for, the amendment process. Is it for reining in constitutional violations or for correcting errors? And again, as we look at different quotations from the founders talking about using the amendment process, Hamilton says it's for supplying for any defects that may be found in the Constitution. Madison, it was for the amendment of errors in the Constitution. George Washington says in his farewell address, if the distribution or modification of constitutional powers be in any particular wrong, let it be corrected by the amendment process as the Constitution designates. What's he saying it's for? If you find an error in the Constitution, change the Constitution. Madison's letter to Edward Everett tells us, should the provisions of the Constitution as here reviewed be found not to secure the liberty and happiness of the people against usurpations and abuses. Now notice what he's saying here. This is interesting. Could the Constitution be a source of why the federal government is usurping and abusing power? Yeah. He's suggesting that is one possibility. On the other hand, could they simply be ignoring clear provisions of the Constitution? I think those are two different root causes, aren't they? And we need to analyze which one is the real root of the problem today. In this letter in this note from George Mason, this is actually Madison's notes of the 1787 Constitutional Convention, where they were forming our Constitution. George Mason talked about the need for an amendment process through the states as well as through Congress. He says, no amendments of the proper kind will ever be obtained by the people if the government should become oppressive. Now, in this one, does he define one or the other here? Is he talking about government becomes oppressive because of errors in the Constitution, or is he talking about they're just blatantly ignoring it? He doesn't say. This one is just vague. And this is one that Article 5 convention promoters point to as, see, this is why we're supposed to do it. This is why it's in there. But it doesn't tell us, if they're blatantly ignoring the Constitution, you need to change the Constitution. In fact, the logic here is inescapable, isn't it? The logic we see here is, if there are flaws in the Constitution, change the Constitution. But if your problems are elsewhere, they're just ignoring the Constitution, then we need to fix them. And George Mason, elsewhere in the Constitutional Convention of 1787, did clarify why he felt amendments might be necessary. He says, the plan now to be formed will certainly be defective. Amendments, therefore, will be necessary. They didn't think that they were going to create a perfect document. It would probably need some tweaking over the years. And if it has, again, errors in the Constitution, that's what the amendment process is for. It is not for reining in constitutional violations. However, they do give us some good ideas of what to do in that case as well. And for my assessment today, as I began this presentation, the problems we're facing are not because of flaws in the Constitution. If we were to be following the Constitution as written, you may remember I mentioned, it would solve the majority of the problems our nation's facing right now. What we're needing to look at is reining in constitutional violations. Changing the Constitution does not address the root of the problem. So what does? Article 6. Article 6 of the Constitution, starting with Clause 3, this is the Oath of Office Clause. And it requires everybody at any level of government, national, state, local, whether members of Congress, as it says here, senators and representatives before mentioned, that being Congress, and the members of the several state legislatures, as well as executive judicial officers, the United States and of the states themselves, shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution. Who's required to swear an oath of office to the Constitution? Everybody at every level of government, appointed or elected, military, police, sheriffs, on and on. Let me point out two key groups here that are key to protecting and reining in protecting the Constitution. The members of the several state legislatures, they have a very key obligation in enforcing the Constitution. And their job, their role, as I see it, is largely defensive, to defend against abuses of the Constitution. The second group I want to point to is Congress, the senators and representatives before mentioned. Their role can really be both, but they're the ones that have the power of going on the offense. That if there is a violation of the Constitution by the president, for example, we talked about their power to impeach him. If the Supreme Court is overstepping their bounds, Congress has the power to go after the Supreme Court. They can impeach judges. They can restrict the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. They can dissolve and restructure the lower courts. Congress has tremendous power to go on the offense to rein in the federal government. Both of these, the state legislatures and Congress, are at our disposal. As James Garfield said, we the people are responsible for the character of our Congress. We're also responsible for the character of our state legislature, aren't we? So it looks like this. We the people hold our elected officials accountable to their oath to uphold the Constitution. As we hold the state legislatures accountable to it, through them we can hold Congress accountable to it, but then also we the people can directly hold Congress accountable to the Constitution. We'll get into some details of how that works. So, the oath of office. I've spent a fair amount of time in state legislatures, and I've gotten the idea that most state legislators think that their oath is something like this. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will be subject and subservient to the federal government, and that I will support and defend all laws passed by Congress, the Supreme Court, the President of the United States, or the federal agencies, because they all make laws, never questioning their authority to legislate in all matters whatsoever. Does that sound like an oath of office to you? That is effectively what we see as the general mentality, because over and over again I hear the idea that the federal government has spoken, we must comply. Because, of course, everything the federal government does is supreme over the states. That's the idea that they're given. What is the oath of office? It's generally something like this. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. They're swearing an oath to uphold the Constitution. What happens when their oath to the Constitution conflicts with upholding a federal law? The federal law and the Constitution don't mesh. Which one are they swearing an oath to uphold? Again, pretty obvious, isn't it? The Constitution. By their oath, if they intend to uphold their oath, then they can't also uphold unconstitutional federal law. That is why the oath of office is in there. Now, but doesn't that violate the Supremacy Clause? That's the common objection I get there. Have you ever read the Supremacy Clause? Because the Supremacy Clause answers that. Now here's what they want you to believe the Supremacy Clause says. This Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be passed by the federal government, any federal branch, doesn't matter which one, right? They can all pass laws. Any laws of the United States which shall be passed by the federal government shall be the supreme law of the land. That's not what it says. In fact, it places a limitation on what federal laws are supreme. What it says is, the laws of the United States which shall be, here are the key words, made in pursuance thereof. Made in following the Constitution. Laws made that are in following the Constitution are supreme and they should be upheld. However, what does that mean for laws that are not in pursuance thereof? Actually, Alexander Hamilton answered that question beautifully for us in Federalist 33. He says, acts of the federal government which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers are merely acts of usurpation, meaning theft of power, and will deserve to be treated as such. How do you do that? How do you treat an unconstitutional federal law as nothing more than an act of usurpation? You oppose it. You stand in the way of it. This is, in a sense, the Article 6 solution that is required by the oath of office of every state government official. They are swearing an oath to uphold the Constitution, not upholding unconstitutional laws. This is why I refer to nullification as the Article 6 solution. And the hashtag Article 6, not 5. Because Article 6 is merely nothing more or less than constitutional enforcement. Now, oddly, I've had some people try to tell me that constitutional enforcement is unconstitutional. Yeah. Okay. We'll just leave that one at that. Upholding the Constitution is required by the oath of office. Let's get into that a little further now. So to rein in constitutional violations, the founding fathers tell us that states already have the power without any changes to the Constitution. For example, Madison tells us in Federalist 46, the means of opposition to it are powerful and at hand. Schemes of usurpation will easily be defeated by the state governments, who will be supported by the people. And that's key. We, the people, need to support our state legislators in blocking unconstitutional actions. Without that support, they won't have the backbone to do it. Another one, the state governments, with the people on their side, will be able to repel the danger. Hamilton, Federalist 16. I love this one. Pay close attention to this one. If the cooperation of the state legislatures be necessary to give effect to a measure of the Union, they have only not to act, or to act evasively, and the measure is defeated. When I was on speaking tour earlier this year in Texas, a number of our attendees of my speech talked to me about, well, Texas Governor Abbott is saying there is no power the states have to resist unconstitutional federal actions. And my answer, which they videoed to send to him, was very simply, step number 1, stop being complicit in implementing unconstitutional federal law. Yes, the states have a tremendous amount of power that they can use to not act, to not implement. Don't help them do it. That's pretty simple, isn't it? Another one Madison refers to, refusal to cooperate with the officers of the Union. Again, we're not going to help you implement these unconstitutional laws. And Madison also recommends that the state legislature should create legislative devices to present obstructions to the federal government in implementing those unconstitutional laws. Now, a little over a year ago, State governors admitted that the majority of federal programs require the states helping them implement them. This was during the government shutdown, where they were worried, which government programs are we shutting down for you? And so they sent a panicked letter asking Congress to please specify which of these federal programs we're going to be shutting down during the government shutdown. And in the process of that, admitted where the shutoff valve is, didn't they? If the majority of unconstitutional federal programs are being implemented for the federal government by the states, the advice we just read through, refusals to cooperate with the officers of the Union, the states just have to not act in order to block the measure. Wait, are we saying the states actually already have the power? Yes, we are. Absolutely. And the states are beginning to recognize it. This is a positive note here. The 10th Amendment Center in particular likes to track nullification-type bills where the states are standing up saying no. And what they're seeing is a continual increase, legislative session after session, more and more states. The beginning of 2017, in this case, they saw the introduction of over 200 new nullification-type bills saying, we, the states, don't recognize the authority of the federal government on this. We will not be helping implement these laws. Fabulous. The states are beginning to remember the power they already have. Jefferson tells us the several states who formed that instrument, the Constitution, being sovereign and independent, have the unquestionable right to judge of its infraction. And the nullification by those sovereignties of all unauthorized acts done under the color of that instrument, the Constitution, is the rightful remedy. He also tells us without this right, they would be under the dominion, absolute and unlimited, of whosoever might exercise this right of judgment for them. That sounds kind of like today, doesn't it? That if we let only the Supreme Court be the judge of what is and what is not constitutional, then we're under their total dominion. The states are the ones that created them in the first place. Which one's the creator and which one's the creature created? Yeah. James Madison, he answers a very interesting question in Federalist 44. Why is it that our state-level officials, our governors, our state legislators are required not only to swear an oath of office to their state constitutions, but also to the federal? What does the U.S. Constitution have to do with a governor or a state legislator? And his answer was, the members and officers of the state governments will have the essential agency in giving effect to the Constitution. Have they done so? Are they giving effect, making the Constitution effective today? No. And yet that is their oath-bound duty. Now, just a little bit of stepping back for a moment and defining things. Nullification and interposition are often used somewhat interchangeably. Interposition is simply this. It is when an intermediate level government official steps in to protect against the tyranny of a higher level official. Such as with the Magna Carta. The lords came before the king and said, we demand you sign that we have rights. Great example of interposition. They interposed, they stood between. The Boston Tea Party was also an act of interposition. The Declaration of Independence, and really the entire American Revolution, were based on these concepts of interposition and nullification. In other words, there is nothing more American than to stand for interposition and nullification. It's the very foundation of our nation. Nullification, a little more specifically, is nothing more or less than enforcing constitutional laws, not enforcing or even resisting laws which have no constitutional authority. It is upholding the Constitution. And oddly, when someone tells me that nullification is unconstitutional, you mean enforcing the Constitution is unconstitutional? I don't follow the logic on that one at all. Now, just briefly, occasionally those who don't want us to use nullification will make such claims as, well, Madison opposed nullification later in life. Sure, in 1798, where this quote comes from, he supported it, but as he grew older, he thought, oh, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. That is not true. Just to set the record straight here briefly, here in 1798, where he was writing in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, he had authorship in the Virginia resolutions opposing the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, which included, among other things, a provision that said it was illegal for people to speak against the actions of the president or Congress. And they recognized, Madison and Jefferson recognized, this was a clear violation of the Constitution and our freedom of speech. And he says, in case of a deliberate, palpable, and dangerous exercise of other powers not granted by the Constitution, he's referring to there, the states who are party to have the right and are in duty bound to interpose, according to their oath of office, right? For arresting the progress of evil, to preserve the Constitution itself, as well as provide for the safety of the parties to it. And yet, in 1834, Madison is often quoted as saying, and this is true, he did say this, nullification has the effect of putting powder under the Union, under the Constitution and the Union, and a match in the hand of every party to blow them up at pleasure. That doesn't sound like he's supporting nullification, does it? I would ask, what kind? What kind of nullification is he opposing there? And a hint in that same letter says, the offspring of the discontents of South Carolina. He was referring to what we might call as nullification as advocated by John Calhoun, which was very different from the type of nullification that he and Jefferson, in the next quote, were advocating earlier. In fact, later the same year in 1834, December, Madison wanted to set the record very straight, where he endorses Jeffersonian-type nullification. He says, but where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, he's quoting Jefferson here, every state has a natural right, in cases not within the compact, to nullify. And then he interjects his own thoughts on Jefferson's statement there. He says, thus, the right of nullification meant by Jefferson is the natural right which all admit to be a remedy against insupportable oppression. Is he endorsing nullification here? I don't think there's any question about that. All admit this is a natural right as a remedy against insupportable oppression. So 3 or 4 months prior to that, he's saying nullification has the effect of putting powder under the Constitution of the Union and blowing it up. What's he talking about? Nullification as advocated by John Calhoun was very different. Let me give you a definition here. John Calhoun was suggesting the idea that one state, South Carolina, could nullify, in this case, a trade tariff for the entire Union and block it from any state being able to observe that trade tariff unless and until 3/4 of the states gathered together in convention to override their nullification. That's a very different concept of nullification than what was advocated by Madison and Jefferson. Simply saying on their own that as a state, we will not be helping implement this law within our state. What other states do is up to them. Totally different concept. Madison never spoke against that Jeffersonian type of nullification. It is the natural right which all admit should be a remedy against insupportable oppression. Okay, so moving forward, what about the people? We, the people, already have the power as well to rein in constitutional violations directly to Congress. We can do it through our state legislature, but then we also have a direct influence on our members of Congress. Again, looking at the founder's words, means of opposition to this are powerful at hand. Madison refers to the power of the people as the ultimate redress against constitutional violations. He refers to the power of the disquietude of the people being a powerful tool. What is disquietude? That's not a word we use often enough. I love that word. Disquietude. It means the people are getting upset. They're starting to speak against what you're doing. And if you, as an elected member of Congress, are seeing a massive increase in the disquietude of your citizens, of your constituents, about the role you're playing in Congress, your chances for re-election are starting to go down. That is a much more powerful tool than we give it credit. It's effectively the same power. Do you remember question number 10 in my quiz? Which of the three branches of government has the greatest power? It was Congress. Because Congress holds the power of impeachment, of kicking them out of office. Well, we the people hold that power over all of Congress and the state legislatures. We the people then, that means, are the highest power in the land, because we hold that ultimate power over Congress, who is the highest power in all of the federal government. Next, we'll go through a few more of these. The people who can by the election of more faithful representatives annul the acts of the usurpers. Again, this is a powerful tool to kick them out of office. The usurpation would require the concurrence of the courts of justice and the body of the people. The people have to go along with the usurpation in order for it to happen, in order for it to stand. And my favorite quote in this section is this one. In order to keep the Constitution in check, the people have this obligation. It says, a people enlightened enough to distinguish between a legal exercise and an illegal usurpation of authority. That's what's required. They spelled this out very clearly, didn't they? And as such a people are the natural guardians of the Constitution. We are the ones that are supposed to be guarding the Constitution. And if it's not being enforced, ultimately we the people are the ones to blame. So, a people enlightened enough. I love that phrase, because that is the target. When we have a people enlightened enough to enforce the Constitution, it's followed. In a presentation I gave entitled The Power of 500, we illustrate this very clearly, that even more powerful than electing better representatives is holding them accountable in between elections. That is, I would say, the most powerful tool the people have, holding them accountable between elections. I'll show you just a brief example of how that is done. By demanding adherence to the Constitution. Again, I'll bring up the New American report, the Freedom Index. If you go to thenewamerican.com, you can look up the voting records of Congress compared to the Constitution in the Freedom Index. You go right here on the top tab where it says Freedom Index. You click on that, and it'll bring up a page that looks like this. And here you can look through, scrolling down, a list of all the current members of the House and Senate and what their current scores are. Or in this search by name box there, you can look up past ones as well and see what their entire record is of how they voted in Congress. And you can see specifically every bill that we rated them on that they voted the wrong way, that they violated their oath of office. That is a very powerful resource. Let me show you how it can be used. And as you get into this, each of the bills that we're rating them on gives a specific example of, we have assigned a positive score to those who voted yes or no because. The because part explains how that squares with the Constitution and freedom principles. Now, a few years ago, when I first moved to Montana, our congressman at the time was Denny Rehberg, and throughout his life as a member of Congress, he'd scored anywhere as low as 30% on up to his high score ever was a 67% on the Freedom Index. And when I first moved there in 2009, his most recent score just came out as I got there. In July, he had a 60%. Here's what we did. We got copies of his voting record on that most recent report and went to the next town hall meeting he held. I showed up at the door dressed in a suit and tie and was handing them to everyone as they came in the door. And they all started getting the idea that I was with his staff and, oh, thank you, and, went and sat down. And little by little, I started hearing people saying things like, I don't think he was with the Rehberg staff, as they started reading through what I had handed them. Because it wasn't particularly favorable. It showed all the different unconstitutional votes he had done recently. And as the meeting ensued, there began to be a lot of questions from the audience. Where did you feel you had the authority for this vote? And as we began to do this across Montana, every time he held a public meeting, he'd run into more of us that had copies of his voting record and were asking these key questions. We started handing these out, spreading them all over the state. And by the next Freedom Index edition, just a few months later, his score jumped up to an 80%. That's impressive. Next score, 6 months later, 80%. The next one, 90%. The next one, 90%. And then he decided he wanted to run for another office, and we got a new congressman. There's a lesson here. Is that a notable change? This is what we call the power of 500, where just a few people working in a coordinated fashion can hold their feet to the fire so they pay attention. Now, in this case, he changed almost immediately. And he began to refer to me and our team effort as my conscience. And he actually publicly thanked us for keeping him honest, was his words for it. Thanks for keeping me honest, keeping me on the ball of what I'm supposed to be doing. This can be done. This isn't that hard. And it can be done in any congressional district. If we start holding their feet to the fire, they start to get the hint. It is really that simple. So this brings me back to the same point. We already have the power. We just need to use it. That brings us to that ruby slippers concept, right? So to wrap up, I have a few quotes I want to share with you from the Founding Fathers that emphasize this point. Thomas Jefferson tells us, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be. Think about that one for a moment. That is exactly what every solution is trying to do if it doesn't try to solve the root of the problem. If we don't try to solve the ignorance, no plan to preserve our freedom is going to work. We're trying to do what never was and never will be, right? That's exactly what the Article 5 Convention movement is trying to accomplish. Never mind the ignorance of the people, we're going to save you from your ignorance with certain magical amendments to the Constitution. That's an impossibility. John Adams warns us, liberty cannot be preserved without a general knowledge among the people. Jefferson tells us what we need to do. Educate and inform the whole mass of the people. They are the only sure reliance for the preservation of our liberty. Now, not a founding father, but a great quote worth sharing. Thomas Edison. The strength of the Constitution lies in the will of the people to defend it. Constitutions are not self-enforcing. In fact, Madison goes into that in the Federalist Papers as well. He refers to them as parchment barriers. It's just a piece of paper. Unless we enforce it, it means nothing. So again, as we educate the people, then this chart has meaning. As the people understand the Constitution and demand adherence to it, they can then hold their state officials accountable to it, and with their state officials, can exert pressure on Congress. Plus, we the people can directly influence our Congress through what I called the power of 500. Through those two angles, Congress has the power to rein in the entire federal government. Keep that in mind. That is why Congress is really the key to turning everything around. So, in conclusion, we need to learn the Constitution. And as we do so, I have to endorse my own course, the 6-lecture course on the Constitution called The Constitution is the Solution. It was specifically designed for this purpose, to educate people on what we need to know to get the federal government back on track. That way we can build a team and magnify our voice. A lot of times people are frustrated. Yes, I call my congressman all the time. One person calling won't make a difference. We need to coordinate this effort so that it magnifies your voice. One living room at a time. Remember what I began with? I was invited to a class in my own living room. It's one of the best ways to get people to show up. When we the people understand and demand adherence to the Constitution, it will be followed. The solution is simple. That's really all it takes. But it takes work and it takes people. It takes numbers of people to implement the plan. This is the plan the Founding Fathers pointed to, constitutional enforcement. When the federal government oversteps their bounds, we need to understand the Constitution and demand adherence to it. Please join us in that cause. Help us to enforce the Constitution. And we can preserve the liberty of our nation. Thank you. Thank you for coming out.